January 17, 1945, somewhere over the Atlantic. The transport ship rolls beneath a slate-gray sky. Below deck, in the converted cargo hold, 200 German prisoners huddle on wooden benches bolted to steel floors. The air is thick with salt, diesel fumes, and the sour smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Most are young, boys really, conscripted in the final desperate months when the Wehrmacht scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel. Their uniforms are torn, stained with mud from the Ardennes, from Hurtgen, from forests whose names they can barely pronounce. They do not speak much. The engine's throb fills the silence, a mechanical heartbeat carrying them toward a land they know only through propaganda films and whispered rumors. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Richter sits near the bulkhead, his back against cold metal. He is 23 but looks older. His right hand trembles, not from fear, he tells himself, but from the concussion grenade that exploded too close during the American breakthrough at Bastogne. He clutches a small photograph. His mother standing in front of their apartment in Dresden before the war, before everything. He wonders if the building still stands. He wonders if he will ever see her again. Around him, his fellow prisoners whisper questions no one can answer. What will the Americans do with us? Will they work us to death in mines like the Soviets? Will there be trials? Executions? The stories from the Eastern Front have reached even the Western armies, tales of retribution, of prisoners who simply vanished into the Siberian vastness. Richter closes his eyes and tries to remember the last meal he ate that wasn't from a can, or boiled in a helmet over a makeshift fire. The ship shudders. The crossing takes 4 days. To understand the shock that awaited these men, one must first understand what they were leaving behind. By January 1945, Germany was a nation consuming itself. The Reich that once stretched from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow had contracted into a shrinking fortress, its cities reduced to skeletal ruins by relentless Allied bombing. The civilian ration in Germany had fallen to approximately 1,400 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life, let alone labor. For soldiers at the front, conditions were marginally better, but only just. The Wehrmacht's supply lines had collapsed under the weight of Allied air superiority. Troops in the Ardennes offensive survived on black bread so dense it could chip teeth, ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, and horse meat when they were fortunate enough to find a carcass. The German soldier had been raised on a doctrine of hardness, of Härte, the belief that deprivation forged superior men. National Socialist ideology preached self-sacrifice for the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, and glorified suffering as a crucible of racial strength. Goebbels' propaganda machine had spent years portraying Germany as encircled by decadent enemies. The effete British, the culturally inferior Soviets, and the mongrelized Americans, a nation of capitalist excess, racial impurity, and spiritual weakness. In Nazi instruction films, American soldiers were depicted as cowards who relied on material superiority because they lacked German discipline and will. America, they were told, was a land of gangsters and Jews, of shallow consumerism and hollow values, a civilization already in decline, waiting to be swept aside by history. This was the lens through which Ernst Richter and his comrades viewed their captors. They expected brutality because that is what they had been taught to expect. They expected deprivation because that is all they had known for years. What they did not expect, what they could not have imagined, was stake. Camp Rust in Louisiana. February 1945. The train journey from the East Coast Processing Center takes 2 days. The prisoners stare through barred windows at a landscape that seems impossible. Endless flat fields, towns untouched by war, automobiles on paved roads, electric lights burning without fear of bombers overhead. No rubble, no craters, no scorched earth. When the train stops at small stations, American civilians gather on the platforms, not to jeer or throw stones, but to watch with casual curiosity. Some eating ice cream, children waving at the strange men in gray uniforms. Richter presses his face to the glass and feels something crack inside him. This is the enemy homeland. This is the nation they were told was on the verge of collapse. The gates of Camp Rustin swing open. The prisoners are marched through in columns, past guard towers and double fences topped with barbed wire. But the guards are relaxed, smoking cigarettes, some even nodding in what might be greeting. No dogs, no whips. The commandant, a middle-aged colonel with a weary face, addresses them through an interpreter in crisp, formal German. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated in accordance with international law. You will be housed, clothed, and fed. You will work as permitted under the convention, but you will be paid a wage in camp scrip. You will receive mail. You will be allowed to send letters home. Any man who attempts escape will be apprehended and punished under military law. But you will not be tortured or executed. You are not animals. You are soldiers. We were soldiers. We understand what that means. The words hang in the air. Some prisoners glance at each other, uncertain whether to believe. They are divided into barracks, long wooden structures with proper bunks, mattresses filled with straw that doesn't reek of mildew, wool blankets that are whole and clean. Each man receives 2 sets of clothing, blue denim work uniforms with PW stenciled on the back. They are issued soap, real soap, not the gritty ersatz bars that disintegrated in water and left skin raw, but actual soap that lathers, that smells faintly of something between lye and lavender. Richter holds the bar in his hand, turning it over, studying it as if it were an artifact from another world. Then comes the first meal. The mess hall is vast, lined with long tables and benches. The prisoners file in, still silent, still wary, expecting perhaps thin broth and stale bread. Instead, the American cooks, most of them black soldiers, Richter notes, men the Reich propaganda had said were subhuman, stand behind steam trays piled high with food. Actual food. Mashed potatoes, green beans glistening with butter, fresh white bread, not the dense wartime Kommissbrot, and meat, not horse meat, not mystery tins, but thick slabs of beef, pan-fried, still sizzling, fat crisped at the edges. Steak. Richter stares at his tray. He looks at the men around him. Someone whispers, "Das ist nicht möglich." This is not possible. Another prisoner, a boy of perhaps 19, begins to weep silently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. The American guards watch but say nothing. They have seen this reaction before. The first bite is an act of cognitive dissonance. The meat is tender, rich, flavored with salt and black pepper. Richter's body, starved for protein and fat, responds with an almost violent surge of saliva. He chews slowly, methodically, the way one handles something precious. Around him, the mess hall fills with the sound of eating. Not the frenzied gulping of starvation, but something approaching reverence. No one speaks. The food is too important. The food is too real. After the meal, an older prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Walter Schmidt, sits on his bunk staring at his hands. "I do not understand," he says to no one in particular. "Why do they feed us like this? We are the enemy. We killed their men. Why do they give us their food?" No one has an answer. The historical record of American POW camps is extensive and, by the standards of World War II, extraordinary. The United States held approximately 425,000 prisoners of war on its soil between 1942 and 1946, primarily Germans, with smaller numbers of Italians and Japanese. The camps were distributed across the country, from the deserts of Arizona to the farmlands of Wisconsin, and their treatment of prisoners was governed strictly by the 1929 Geneva Convention. The United States adhered to these rules not out of altruism alone, but from calculated self-interest. American and British soldiers held in German stalags would, it was hoped, receive reciprocal treatment. But there was also something deeper at work, something ideological. America's abundance was not incidental. It was deliberate. It was a weapon. The daily caloric intake for prisoners in American camps averaged 3,500 to 4,000 calories, more than the average American civilian received during rationing, and nearly 3 times what German soldiers at the front were subsisting on by late 1944. Prisoners were given access to canteens where they could purchase cigarettes, candy, and toiletries with wages earned from labor. They played soccer on athletic fields. They staged theatrical performances. They formed orchestras. Camps had libraries stocked with books in German, newspapers, and even German-language camp newsletters that prisoners printed themselves. At Camp Como in Mississippi, POWs built a replica Bavarian village complete with a beer garden. At Camp Pine in New York, they painted murals of the Alps on barrack walls. This was not mercy. This was demonstration. The American military understood that the battlefield of World War II extended beyond Normandy, and the Pacific Islands. It was a war of ideologies, fascism versus democracy, totalitarianism versus individual freedom, scarcity versus abundance. Every meal served in a POW camp was an argument. Every bar of soap, every pack of cigarettes, every hour spent reading a book or attending a film screening was evidence against the lies these men had been fed by Goebbels and Hitler. The prisoners were being re-educated not through propaganda lectures, though those came too, but through the simple, irrefutable experience of living in a society that could afford to treat even its enemies with dignity. Ernst Richter begins to work. The Geneva Convention permits prisoners to be employed in non-military labor, and the American economy, drained of workers by conscription, needs hands. Richter is assigned to a lumber operation in the pine forests outside Camp Ruston. The work is hard, felling trees, hauling logs, operating saws, but it is not cruel. The guards do not beat them. There are rest breaks. Lunch is brought to the worksite in trucks. Sandwiches made with real ham, thermoses of hot coffee, apples. The American foreman, a Cajun man with a thick accent Richter cannot fully parse, treats them like any other crew, barking orders but also joking, slapping backs, handing out cigarettes during breaks. One afternoon, the foreman's son, a boy of perhaps 10, visits the site. He stares at the prisoners with open fascination, clutching a baseball glove. His father says something in English and the boy approaches Richter cautiously, then holds out a piece of candy, a Tootsie Roll. Richter will later learn it is called. Richter takes it, unsure of the etiquette, and the boy grins and runs off. That night, lying in his bunk, Richter unwraps the candy slowly. It is sweet, almost cloyingly so, chewy and tasting faintly of chocolate. He makes it last as long as he can. He thinks about the boy's face. He thinks about German children in bombed-out cities, picking through rubble for scraps. He thinks about what that boy would have been taught to believe about him. The cognitive dissonance deepens. Letters begin to arrive from home. They are censored. Black lines redacted across portions deemed sensitive, but they come. Richter receives one from his mother. The handwriting is shaky. She is alive. Dresden is not. The letter is dated late February 1945, before the firestorm, but her words are bleak. No coal, no electricity most days, food rations cut again, neighbors vanished. Some fled west, some arrested by the Gestapo for defeatist talk. I am proud of you, she writes, and Richter knows it is a lie of love. She wants him to survive. She wants him to stay where he is, in America, far from the collapsing Reich. Other prisoners receive no letters at all. Their families are in the Soviet zone or in regions overrun in the final offensives or simply gone. The mail call becomes a weekly ritual of hope and despair. Men clutch envelopes like sacred relics. Men sit in silence when their names are not called. The camp library becomes a refuge. Richter discovers books that were banned in Germany. Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, American authors like Steinbeck and Hemingway translated into German. He reads slowly, laboriously, with a dictionary liberated from the library's shelves. The ideas are disorienting. These books speak of individual conscience, of questioning authority, of moral ambiguity. They do not offer the clean certainties of National Socialist doctrine. They are messy, human, troubling. He reads All Quiet on the Western Front and feels a recognition so profound it nauseates him. Remarque was called a traitor. His books were burned. But here in an American prison camp, Richter is free to read them. The irony is not lost on him. Spring arrives. The Louisiana heat is oppressive, but the camp is shaded by pines and oaks. Prisoners are allowed outside during recreation hours. They play soccer, form study groups, debate philosophy and politics in ways that would have been dangerous, fatal even, in the barracks of the Wehrmacht. Some remain fervent Nazis, true believers who insist the war can still be won, that secret weapons will turn the tide, that the Führer has a plan. They form cliques, enforce ideological purity, threaten fellow prisoners they deem defeatist or traitorous. The American camp administrators monitor these tensions, but do not intervene unless violence erupts. They understand that the prisoners are working through their own internal collapse, that the disintegration of the Reich is happening not just in Europe but here, in microcosm among these men. Other prisoners begin to change. They attend the re-education programs offered by American instructors, lectures on democracy, on the Constitution, on the history of representative government. At first, many attend out of boredom, or for the cigarettes distributed at the end of sessions. But the ideas seep in. The instructors do not shout or demand ideological conformity. They ask questions. They present evidence. They show films, not propaganda, but documentaries. Film of liberated concentration camps, film of Bergen-Belsen, of Dachau, skeletal figures in striped uniforms staring at the camera with hollow eyes. The screening room is silent. Some prisoners refuse to watch. Some insist it is fabricated enemy lies, but others, like Richter, sit frozen, unable to look away. He thinks of the rumors that circulated in the Wehrmacht, whispers about actions in the East, about the SS, about things no one spoke of openly. He thinks of the times he did not ask questions, did not want to know. The film flickers. The bodies are piled like cordwood. The American narrator's voice is calm, factual, relentless. "This is what you fought for," the voice says, not accusing, stating fact. Richter walks out of the screening into the humid night and vomits into the grass. He kneels there, shaking, and realizes that the foundation of his entire adult life has been built on a lie. Not just a lie about the enemy, but a lie about himself, about his nation, about everything he was taught to believe was noble and true. The steak, the soap, the books, the letters, they were not kindnesses. They were mirrors. They were forcing him to see what he had refused to see. By summer, the war in Europe is over. The news reaches Camp Rustin in May. Unconditional surrender, Hitler dead, Berlin in ruins. The prisoners gather in the mess hall to hear the announcement. Some weep, some sit in stunned silence. The Nazi diehards rage, shouting that it is a lie, that it is Allied propaganda. But the proof is incontrovertible. The Reich is gone. The 1,000-year empire lasted 12. The question now is, what happens to us? The repatriation process is slow. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of prisoners back to a devastated Europe take months, years. Many prisoners do not want to return. Germany is divided, occupied, starving. Letters from home, those that still arrive, paint a picture of apocalyptic ruin. Men whose families were in the Soviet zone face a choice between American captivity and potential Soviet retribution. Some prisoners begin to inquire about staying. Can we immigrate? Can we apply for citizenship? The answers are complicated, bureaucratic, uncertain. Richter continues to work. He continues to read. He befriends an American guard, a farm boy from Iowa named Tom who shares photographs of his family's homestead. Explains the concept of crop rotation. Talks about soil and weather and the price of corn with the same passion German officers once spoke of tactical maneuvers. Tom asks Richter about Germany, about what it was like before the war, and listens without judgment. "Seems like you got sold a bad bill of goods," Tom says one evening, and Richter laughs. A bitter, painful sound, because the understatement is so profound it borders on absurdity. The soap becomes a symbol. It is such a small thing, such an ordinary object in American life that no one thinks twice about it. But for the prisoners, it represents something larger than hygiene. It represents surplus. It represents a society that produces enough not just to survive, but to offer comfort, dignity, even to enemies. In Germany, soap had become a wartime legend. Jokes about the regime rendering down human fat, though most dismissed it as black humor born of desperation. But the shortage was real. By 1944, civilian soap rations had been cut so severely that people bathed once a week if they were fortunate, washed clothes in cold water with ash, developed skin infections and sores that wouldn't heal. Here, in America, they received soap every week. Fresh bars, sometimes scented. Richter begins to hoard them, stacking the unused bars in his footlocker like a miser hoarding gold. He does not know why. Perhaps it is insurance against the day the abundance ends. The day the Americans run out or change their minds or decide prisoners no longer deserve such luxuries. Perhaps it is simply the reflex of a man who has lived through scarcity too long, but every time he handles the soap he thinks about what it means. He thinks about a nation that can afford to waste resources on the comfort of its enemies. He thinks about the propaganda films that called America weak and decadent. He thinks about how wrong they were. The steak too becomes mythic. Not every meal is steak. That would be absurd even by American standards, but meat is regular. Chicken, pork, beef in various forms. Meals are substantial, varied, sometimes even excessive. At Christmas 1945, the camp serves turkey with all the trimmings, stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, pumpkin pie for dessert. Richter eats until his stomach aches. He looks around the mess hall at men who, a year ago, were eating snow mixed with grain alcohol to stave off frostbite and hunger in the Ardennes. Some are smiling. Some are crying. The Germans have a word: torchless panic. The fear of a closing door, the panic that opportunity is slipping away. Richter feels its opposite. A door opening slowly, painfully into a world he does not yet understand but can no longer deny. The freedom is the most complicated gift. It is not freedom in the literal sense. They are still prisoners, still confined behind fences, still subject to roll calls and regulations. But it is a different kind of freedom, a freedom of mind. They can read what they wish. They can speak openly, debate, argue, question. They can receive letters and send them. They can practice religion or not without fear. Catholic prisoners attend Mass. Protestant prisoners hold their own services. Jewish prisoners, the few who had hidden their identity in the Wehrmacht, can cautiously, tentatively reclaim what they had concealed. The American chaplains facilitate all of it without preference or punishment. This freedom is terrifying. For men raised under totalitarianism, where every aspect of life was regimented and controlled, where deviation meant denunciation, where independent thought was dangerous, the sudden absence of that structure is destabilizing. Some prisoners cling to the old certainties because certainty, even if false, is comforting. Others flounder, unmoored, unsure how to navigate a world where they must make choices for themselves. Richter finds himself in the latter category. He lies awake at night wrestling with questions that have no easy answers. What does he believe now? Who is he? Stripped of the uniform and the ideology and the nation that defined him, what does he owe to the past? What does he owe to the future? He does not know. But the fact that he can ask the questions, that he is alive to ask them, that no one will punish him for asking, is itself a form of liberation. Historical records indicate that approximately 5,000 German POWs chose to remain in the United States after the war, though the exact number is difficult to verify due to the chaos of post-war immigration. Many married American women. Many settled in rural areas where their agricultural or technical skills were valued. Some changed their names, buried their pasts, became Americans in the fullest sense. Others carried the weight of their histories quietly, private ghosts haunting their new lives. The American government, initially hesitant, eventually allowed limited immigration under specific conditions. It was pragmatic. The country needed labor, needed settlers for the vast interior, needed people willing to work hard and ask few questions. Ernst Richter returns to Germany in late 1946. The choice is not easy. His mother is still alive, barely, living in a basement in what remains of Dresden. He cannot abandon her. The ship that carries him back across the Atlantic is crowded with repatriated prisoners, with displaced persons, with the human debris of a war that consumed continents. He stands on the deck as the American coast disappears behind him, and feels a grief so profound it has no name. He is returning to a homeland that no longer exists, to a nation divided and occupied, to cities that are graveyards. Germany is worse than he imagined. The photographs, the newsreels, the letters, none prepared him for the reality. Entire city blocks reduced to ash, children with the eyes of old men picking through rubble, women trading sex for cigarettes, for chocolate, for anything that might keep their families alive another day. The occupation zones carve the country into spheres of influence. The Americans are the most lenient occupiers, but leniency is relative. There are trials. There are purges. Former party members, former soldiers are screened, interrogated, categorized. Richter is processed, deemed low risk, released. He finds his mother. She does not recognize him at first. He has put on weight in America. His face has color. He looks healthy in a way that seems obscene amid the ruins. He does not speak much about his time in the camp. What would he say? That he ate better as a prisoner than most Germans do now as free people? That his captors treated him with more humanity than his own government ever did? That he learned to read forbidden books and question forbidden ideas and discovered that everything he was taught was a monstrous inversion of truth? These are not conversations one has in occupied Germany in 1946. These are dangerous thoughts. So he keeps them inside, locked away with the bars of soap he smuggled back in his duffel, relics of a time that feels increasingly like a dream. But the experience has changed him. He cannot unsee what he saw. He cannot unlearn what he learned. He finds work in the rebuilding effort, hauling bricks, clearing rubble. The same kind of labor he did in Louisiana, but now in the service of resurrecting something from the ashes. He watches the Marshall Plan pour American dollars into reconstruction. He watches the airlift keep Berlin alive when the Soviets try to starve it into submission. He watches his country, his broken country, slowly transform under the weight of American influence and ideals. Democracy is imposed from above, but it takes root. It grows. It is messy and imperfect and contentious, but it is real. And late at night, when he cannot sleep, Ernst Richter sometimes takes out one of the bars of soap, smaller now, worn down by use, and holds it in his hands and remembers what it felt like to be treated like a human being by people who had every reason to hate him. The story of German POWs in America is a footnote in most histories of World War II, a minor detail overshadowed by the grand narratives of invasion and liberation, of Stalingrad and D-Day, of atomic bombs and unconditional surrender. But it is a story that reveals something essential about the conflict's true nature. This was not merely a war of armies and territories. It was a war of ideas, of systems, of visions for human civilization. Fascism offered a worldview built on hierarchy, scarcity, and perpetual struggle, a universe where strength was the only virtue and compassion was weakness. Democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, offered something different, a vision of abundance, of individual dignity, of the possibility that human beings could govern themselves without a boot on their necks. The stake was propaganda. The soap was propaganda. But propaganda is not inherently false. Sometimes propaganda is simply the truth, presented strategically. The prisoners in American camps were not tortured or starved because the United States understood that demonstrating its values was more effective than any number of leaflets or broadcasts. These men returned to Germany carrying something more dangerous than weapons, the lived experience of an alternative. They had seen that prosperity was possible, that freedom did not mean chaos, that treating even enemies with decency was not weakness but strength. Not all learned the lesson. Some carried their hatreds home and nurtured them in the cellars of their ruined cities, clinging to the old myths because the alternative, accepting complicity in monstrous evil, was too painful. But others, like Richter, could not unlearn what they had learned. They became the bridge generation, the men who remembered both the Reich and what came after, who could compare and contrast and understand in their bones why one system collapsed while the other endured. The epilogue writes itself in the decades that follow. West Germany becomes the economic miracle of post-war Europe, a testament to what happens when democratic institutions and market economics meet a population desperate for redemption and reconstruction. The men who spent time in American POW camps are part of that transformation. They bring back more than memories. They bring a template, a model of how a society can function when it values the individual over the collective, when it trusts its citizens rather than terrorizing them, when it produces enough that even its enemies can eat steak. The soap sits on a shelf in Ernst Richter's small apartment in rebuilt Dresden. He is an old man now in his 70s, the century turning over toward a new millennium. Germany is reunified. The wall has fallen. The Soviet system that once seemed eternal has collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, its own scarcities, its own cruelties. His grandchildren visit and ask about the war, about his time as a soldier, about the camps. He tells them some things. Others he keeps silent. But sometimes, when they are not looking, he takes down the old bar of soap, worn to a sliver now, and holds it and remembers. He remembers the taste of steak when he thought he would never taste meat again. He remembers the feel of clean clothes against skin scrubbed with real soap. He remembers the books that opened doors he did not know existed. He remembers the American guard from Iowa, who treated him like a fellow human being. He remembers the moment in the screening room when the film showed him the truth, and he could no longer hide from it. He remembers the choice he did not know he had, to cling to the lies or to accept the painful, liberating truth. Freedom, he has learned, is not the absence of constraint. It is the presence of choice. It is the ability to question, to change, to grow beyond the ideology that tried to calcify his soul. It is the abundance that allows for dignity, for mercy, for the possibility of redemption even among enemies. It is the simple revolutionary idea that human beings have inherent worth that no state can grant or revoke. The steak was just meat. The soap was just soap. But what they represented, What they demonstrated with the irrefutable logic of experience was that a society built on freedom and abundance could afford to treat even its enemies as human beings. And in doing so, it won a victory more complete than any battlefield conquest. It won the war not just of arms but of ideals. It proved that democracy, for all its messiness and contradictions, could outproduce, outthink, and ultimately outlast systems built on tyranny and scarcity. Ernst Richter dies in his sleep on a winter night, the bar of soap still on his shelf, a small relic of the time he was captured by the enemy and discovered that his captors were more humane than his commanders, more generous than his government, more truthful than his ideology. His grandchildren find it after the funeral, this sliver of aged soap wrapped in old paper, and they do not understand its significance. They throw it away, but the lesson it carried, the truth it symbolized, lives on in the institutions and values that shape their world. They live in a democracy. They live in prosperity. They live without fear of midnight arrests or ideological purges. They take it for granted, as perhaps they should. That is the privilege of those who inherit freedom rather than having to learn its value through its absence. The steak, the soap, the freedom, these were not kindnesses. They were arguments made in the most compelling way possible, through experience, through contrast, through the undeniable reality that a nation strong enough to treat its enemies with dignity is a nation that cannot be defeated by force alone. The German soldiers who could not believe what they received in American captivity learned a lesson more valuable than any they received in Wehrmacht training, that the greatest strength is not hardness, but humanity, not scarcity but abundance, not ideology but truth. And in learning that lesson, they carried it home back to a ruined continent and helped build something new from the ashes of their catastrophic error. The soap dissolved. The memory of the steak faded. But the idea, the dangerous revolutionary idea that human beings deserve dignity and freedom and enough to eat, that idea endured. It spread, it transformed. It became the foundation of a new world, built not on the myths of racial supremacy and perpetual struggle, but on the simple, powerful truth that abundance shared is strength multiplied, and freedom granted even to enemies is the ultimate victory. The war ended in 1945, but the battle of ideas it represented continues. In every generation, in every society that must choose between tyranny and liberty, between scarcity and abundance, between the closed fist and the open hand, the German soldiers who tasted American steak and washed with American soap and read forbidden books in American camps became witnesses to that choice. Their testimony, written not in words but in the transformed trajectory of their lives and their nation, remains one of the most compelling arguments for democracy ever made. Not a lecture or a manifesto, but a meal served to hungry men who expected punishment and received instead an invitation to become something better than they had been. That is the power of steak. That is the revolution of soap. That is the victory of freedom.